Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Center for State's video series on implementation planning and capacity building. This series is produced by the Capacity Building Center for States and funded by the Children's Bureau. The Implementation Planning and Capacity Building Brief is intended to help child welfare agency leaders, managers, and stakeholders take a structured approach to planning the implementation of an activity, program, or intervention to address a problem or need, and consider strategies to building agency capacity to implement it. It does this by providing step-by-step guidance to prepare for implementation, make a plan for addressing any gaps in capacity or capitalizing on strengths, and then develop a plan for implementation that includes the actions needed to get ready, actions needed to implement, and actions to measure implementation progress. Implementation planning and capacity building is broken down into 3 parts and 8 essential functions or steps that may be presented linearly, but they often overlap, and teams will loop back and forth between them. At this point, teams should have outlined the elements to include in their plan, identified the sources to pull the information from, and considered the context and how it may impact implementation. Then revisited their teaming and leadership structure, reviewed readiness assessment findings, and developed strategies to build capacity. In this module, we will look specifically at developing strategies to strengthen motivation. Developing strategies to build capacity is addressed by Module 5 in this series. Before moving on to Part 3, which is development of the implementation plan, it includes building the work plan activities to prepare, roll out, and measure the intervention, activities to communicate and engage stakeholders, and then consolidating the plan as needed. Let's get started. Why do teams develop strategies in their implementation plan to increase motivation to implement the intervention? Quite simply, implementation without buy-in, willingness, or motivation among leaders, managers, frontline staff, and system partners is unlikely to be successful, and implementation efforts will likely struggle. When motivation is high at multiple levels of the organization and across system partners and key groups such as youth and families, then implementation and ultimately the likelihood of successful outcomes are increased. An agency may have the capacity to implement a program or practice, but without motivation or willingness, the intervention will not likely get off the ground. As part of capacity building, teams should identify strategies for strengthening motivation. One way to get started is to think about what elements might make an intervention desirable or undesirable to those who will be delivering or receiving the intervention service. For example, for a frontline worker, a desirable element might be that an intervention will help them support youth education needs, while an undesirable element might be something like more data entry. Strategies that help increase motivation for an intervention will build on and complement each other throughout the change initiative. For example, complementary messaging on how an intervention aligns with core values and complements existing practices, how it addresses the needs of the target population, and a clear connection to how the intervention will support agency and program goals. Messaging should be consistent and reinforced in a variety of ways, in a variety of settings with different stakeholders, for example, in training sessions, meetings, emails, or supervision. Once implementation has started, continue to build motivation by sharing progress, early results, and success stories. Teams can also strengthen motivation by developing strategies and messaging around factors of culture and climate. Some examples include what makes it compatible. For example, showing how the intervention complements agency values and reinforces other programs and ongoing initiatives. What is the relative advantage of this intervention? Share research on why the selected intervention is better than the current practices or other alternatives, and how the agency is prepared for implementation of the selection. How is it manageable? Break down the intervention into clear, manageable parts in training and guidance to make it appear simpler and more doable. And visibility of outcomes, for example, communicating early indications of success in meetings and email announcements. What helps teams to develop strategies that strengthen motivation? Consider the following. Is there strong motivation to change in general, or widespread buy-in and support for the intervention specifically? If not, what strategies might address this? How does the intervention align with and add value to existing agency values, programs, and initiatives? Are there any feasible changes that could strengthen this? And what communication and messaging strategies will help implementation and help build or sustain motivation over time? Considering these questions will help the team identify strategies that account for the unique agency context and support increased motivation to implement and sustain a new program or practice. Let's take a moment to check in on what you've learned about developing strategies to strengthen motivation. Why do teams develop strategies to strengthen motivation? To increase the likelihood of effective and sustainable implementation efforts. How do teams develop strategies to strengthen motivation? Consider strategies and messaging that highlight the intervention advantages, ease of use, and compatibility with the agency, and following up with successes. What can help teams develop strategies to strengthen motivation? By looking at overall motivation for change and intervention-specific buy-in or support, making clear connections to existing agency values, programs, and initiatives, and determining how to communicate to build and sustain motivation. Now take this a step further by reviewing the reflection questions for developed strategies to strengthen motivation in your implementation planning and capacity building workbook to connect what you've learned to your own experience. Up next is Build a Work Plan. Identify activities to get the intervention ready, the seventh module in this series and the first part of Essential Function 5 in implementation planning and capacity building.
This video was created by the Capacity Building Center for States, funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau, under contract HHS P2332014000033C. The content of this video does not necessarily reflect the official views of the Children's Bureau.